Hi, I'm Dr. Jason J. Campbell, and I want to thank you for taking the time to watch my videos. This video I'm continuing my analysis into theories of ethnicity and nationalism. As you know, the notes can be accessed by clicking the link in the description field. It'll take you to the PDF. Download it. We're on section 1.3, and that is on page, we're on section 1.2, and that's on page 5 of the notes. So let's begin. This is theories of ethnicity and nationalism. This one's run out of ink. And this is section 1.2. Alright. So we're going to talk in this section about the 7 types of discrimination. So let's begin with that. Obviously, I don't assume that this is in any sense exhaustive. There's obviously many more types, but with respect to ethnical identity and conflicts associated with ethnicity, I think it's important that we understand these 7 types. So the first is going to be ethnic cleansing, the concept of ethnic cleansing. And here's the direct quote: systematic attempts to eliminate an ethnic or religious group from society, and the example is the Serbs versus the Albanians, right? So in terms of social conflict, ethnical conflict, it is the attempt to eliminate an ethnic or religious group from society. So it has an eliminationist, right, undertone. This undertone is the motivation for extermination. Alright, so in terms of ethnic cleansing, there is the attempt to eliminate members of rival ethnic groupings for any number of reasons. Political power could be one, could be competition over resources, could be another, could be transgenerational conflict, what have you, on and on and on. There are any number of reasons why ethnic groups might see violence. Inter-ethnic violence is the only means of resolving conflict, and one aspect of the ongoing discrimination against a group might be the actual attempt to destroy the group. So that's one. The next is genocide. This is my area of international expertise. I've published on the concept of genocidal intent. I'm not going to go into it in any detail here, so just to read what the author has given us. Again, the book is American Ethnicity, The Dynamics and Consequences of Discrimination. So the author says, the killing of members of an ethnic subpopulation, or potentially the extermination of an entire ethnic group, is obviously the most intense form of discrimination, right? So in terms of the 7 types of discrimination, genocide is the most intense form, according to the author. Now, the author's definition is a bit sketchy, but it's fine. The definition of genocide is the intent to exterminate in whole or in part, right? Either the systematic coordinated destruction with the intent to destroy everyone, or a significant portion of the population of a racial, ethnical, religious group, right? So ethnical group is important in genocide, but the scope of genocide is much larger than just the destruction of an ethnical subgroup. So to be clear, because the author isn't as clear, the intent in terms of genocidal activity, in terms of genocidal campaign, is much larger than just the extermination of an ethnical group. Ethnical group is one constituent element of genocidal campaigns. Genocidal campaign might be motivated by ethnical destruction, but it doesn't have to be motivated. There are certainly genocides that have occurred that weren't directed towards specifically ethnical group destruction. So genocide is obviously an element of discrimination. The idea of expulsion generally, E-X-P-U-L, the idea of expulsion generally The act of exiling members of an ethnic subpopulation from a country can take the form of 1. Direct coercion or indirect coercion. So the distinction between direct coercion or indirect coercion. In terms of direct coercion, we'll see the term usual force. Usually forced. This is what the F-O-R-C-E-D. This is what the author uses. Direct coercion is usually forced. Direct coercion, E-R-C-I-O-N. Okay, so direct coercion is usually forced. So you might think about genocide as a manifestation of direct coercion. I would go a bit further than just saying usually forced. It's a bit ambiguous. I wouldn't say that genocidal campaign is coercive. There are elements that might be coercive, but again, this is not a lecture on genocide, so I'm not going to go into the specifics. But if you think of enforced assimilation as one example, or enforced migration more appropriately, enforced migration would obviously be a coercive means for expelling those from an ethnical population from the state, from protection, from a particular region. The way that it's enforced is if you stay, you die. If you leave, you live, right? So in terms of forced migration would be one element. So I probably should write this down, right? So direct coercion, an example might be forced migration. In terms of forced migration, it's a conditional statement. If you stay, right? So the conditional is if you stay, if ethnical group stays, if ethnical group stays, then they will be killed. Just as like an example, right? If ethnical group X stays, then they will be killed. And the idea is we are directly contributing to the coercive means that will facilitate them leaving. I'm leaving not because I want to leave. Members of the ethnical population aren't leaving because they want to leave. They're leaving because they have to leave. Why do they have to leave? If they stay, they're going to be exterminated, right? So the act of exiling members of an ethnical subpopulation from a country via, one example, forced migration, can take the form of either direct coercion or indirect. In terms of direct coercion, we talked about that. In terms of indirect, creation of social hostilities as a means of incentivizing migration. So indirect coercion is the creation of social hostilities. The creation the creation of social hostilities as a means of incentivizing migration. It's important to recognize that there are many different ways to inform indirectly coercive means for expulsion. Specifically, we're talking about ethnical expulsion. Specifically, if we're talking about ethnical expulsion, there are many ways to go about doing this, right? So social hostility might be one form, which is intergroup conflict. It might be intergroup dynamic wherein one member of the population, one segment of the population receives economic privileges and advantages, social benefits, educational access, political opportunity, job opportunity that other members of the ethnical subpopulation don't receive. And as such, that disparity in opportunity, as one example, creates a social hostility that causes another group to leave, the targeted ethnical population to leave. So that might be an example. Another example that you can easily think of in terms of expulsion might pertain to something less hostile, less obvious. And these are conditions, especially within the United States specifically, that there might be a transformation in the tax structure or the economic dynamics of a particular area that expel people, right? You can imagine taxes in a particular area are raised, And just the fact that the cost of living in that area is more would expel members of a community. Now, it's not specifically directing members of ethnical population X, but based on any number of statistical norms, individuals would be able to identify the tendency for members of a particular group to leave, for example, minorities to leave, when the cost of living in that area rises, so that it's disproportional. As the cost of living in a particular area rises, the diversity of the community decreases, right? If that's true, and it might be, and it probably is true, where the cost of living rises, the ethnical diversity of the population surrounding community decreases, well, you would have instituted a means of homogenizing individuals who live in that community. How did you go about doing that? How did you go about expelling? You didn't go about expelling people through force. You went about expelling people by their standard of living, right? Individuals can't afford members of a targeted population. Target is a bit strong, but members of an ethnically targeted, I guess, population have been expelled, not through direct force. It's not that you can't live here, but we've instituted practices that will discourage you from living here. So there are any number of means that we can talk about expulsion, exclusion, and exclusionary practices that don't implement direct force. It's not always the case that you have to use direct force in order to homogenize the ethnical diversity within the community or protect the ethnical homogeneity of the community. You can, as I said, you can use non-lethal, where's my eraser? You can use non-lethal force, right? So, number 3, in terms of expulsion, is important. Number 4, segregation. So we have ethnical cleansing, genocide, expulsion, segregation. Segregation, the process of spatially isolating members of an ethnic subpopulation in areas where they cannot have the same access. Access is important, right? Where they cannot have the same access to valued resources as do people who are not isolated. And I've linked to my Metropolitan lecture series. In that series, hold on one second. In that series, what I've done is I've talked about zoning, for example. So if you want to see more on this, you can click the link. It'll take you to the series. Type in, Control F if you're using PC, zoning, and watch. I haven't started shooting the videos yet. By the time I finish this, after I finish this, I'll start my Metropolitan videos, but the notes are already up, so you can look at the notes and review the notes. In a few weeks after the posting of this video, I'll have the corresponding lecture on Metropolitan conflict. But the idea of zoning is just that, right? You've created a system in which you can segregate the community on any number of conditions. So the process of spatially isolating members of an ethnic subpopulation in areas where they cannot have the same access to valued resources as do people who are not isolated. Now, in terms of expulsion and segregation, both of these concepts can be unified under one overarching sort of paradigm. It's not necessarily a concept, but it's a series of concepts that formalizes a particular thought. In terms of assimilation, right? So in terms of assimilation, we have the main population, so we'll have the general population, and then we'll have our subpopulations. And there's an existing tension between the general population and the subpopulation. The subpopulations will be identified ethnically. So you would have black, you would have Hispanic, you would have Asian. All of these would be hyphenated. In terms of the United States, it would be Black American, Asian American, Hispanic American. But the American, as such, there really isn't in the United States. We don't have the phrase white American. White America doesn't really make any sense to us. In the States, Black American does, Hispanic American does, Asian American does, but white American, Caucasian American has no significance in our sociolinguistic use. Why? Because there isn't an attempt to assimilate with the main ethnical grouping. The hyphenation and this, I talk about this later in either this series or in my race series, but it's important to bring up at this point because it pertains to both expulsion and segregation. The hyphenation in Black American, Asian American, Hispanic American, that hyphenated American, preserves the tendency to instill an assimilationist sentiment. It preserves the tendency to instill an assimilationist sentiment. It is Black attempting to be American, is how it sounds, right? It's Hispanic attempting to be American. It's Asian attempting to be American. But when we talk about the American, we're talking about the general population, which presupposes an ethnical grouping. The ethnical grouping obviously being white American. In terms of the expulsion, you can see that the general population, from a theoretical standpoint, wants to preserve these distinctiveness, preserve the distinctiveness of each ethnical subgrouping, right? So that to say that you are Black American means that you are not full American. To say, and I'm not saying that this is necessarily the case, I'm not saying that the intent of white people is that they don't want Black Americans to be Americans. I'm talking from sociolinguistics, the way in which we talk about this, the way in which we think about this theoretically preserves the distinctiveness of each ethnical grouping. Why? It preserves the distinctiveness as a mode of expelling the group from the general population, the general population being American. So the force of expulsion, so this sort of arrow going in that way, is the force of expulsion, right? This is the attempt to preserve ethnically defined characteristics, whereas the general population doesn't label themselves ethnically. American is a national identification. American is not an ethnical. This is important, right? This is very important because we're moving from, slowly, we're moving from ethnicity into nationality. And what's essential that you recognize at this point is how attenuated this distinction becomes. It isn't as clear-cut as you might think. But we've arrived at a point where you can actually see the transformation between ethnicity and nationality, and how ethnicity informs nationality, which is the whole point of this theoretical lecture series. Black, Hispanic, Asian are ethnical identifications. Black, Hispanic, and Asian are ethnical group identifications. And any distinctions within those subpopulations reinforce the ethnical group identification. American, in terms of the United States, is not an ethnical identification. American is a national identification. Those from the dominant ethnical grouping do not use ethnical identification. They use national identification. So to say that I am white American would preserve the ethnical identifications which are being used to label others, not self. Ethnical identification is used to label others, not self. National identification is used to label self. That's what's key here. So that when we talk about American versus Black American, Hispanic American, Asian American, Native American, all of those ethnical prefixes, if you will, all of those ethnical prefixes are used to label others, whereas the general population does not use ethnical identification. The general population uses national identification to say that, oh, an American ... an American did this, an American said that. You immediately default to the image of a white American. White American has no meaning, white American has no significance, because the dominant hegemonic discourse excludes ethnical identification and assumes national identification. And the point of this, obviously, of this distinction, which is, I think, is absolutely critical in seeing how we transition from ethnical identity to national identity, is a realization that we are all American, right? If you live in the United States, or we are all British, or we are all French, or we are all Saudi, or we are all I don't know, we're all, pick another country, Jamaican. In terms of that identity, the hyphenated ethnical prefix is a means of excluding. It's a means of expelling. It's a means of pushing out members of ethnical communities from national identification, is what it functions to do. Whether it intended or not is irrelevant. It's not about if it was intended or not. It functions to expel ethnical minorities from national inclusiveness, and that is potentially problematic, while reserving national identification as such for what is acknowledged to be an ethnical group. White in this case. It might be different depending on where you live in the world, but the function, the structure is the same. So you can see why this forced expulsion, and I guess we put force in quotes, right? This forced, the force of expulsion is, it's not a direct force, it's not a physical force. This would be a socio-linguistic force. It would be language as force, language is power. Preserves national identification exclusively for an ethnical group without acknowledging the fact that national identification was in fact preserved for an ethnical group. Ethnical group identification is for others, not for members of the hegemonic class. Segregation obviously becomes facilitated by forced expulsion. Right? Any force that I'm going to use to exclude, any force that I'm going to use to expel others, to identify others as opposed to self, is going to be is going to facilitate segregation. And I mean that both in a socio-political sense, but also, as the author, and I think more appropriately, the author is trying to identify in a geographic sense. You're going to have little Jamaica, little Cuba, little Havana, little Haiti, little China, little da-da-da. Ethnical groups are going to congregate in their quote-unquote little, right? So this would create the little, right? Little Havana, little Haiti, little China, little, they're going to create their little communities, right? All of these communities are going to be identified by the constituent ethnical nature of group identification and group interactivity, right? All of these little communities are going to be identified by that. However, we recognize that members of those communities are all American. We share all the same national identity. Now, I'm not naive enough to believe that there could ever be a case in which people relinquish their ethnical identification for a national identification. Would it be good? I think it might be good, right? There's pros and cons to this. I'm not going to go through that. I do encourage graduate students, if you're interested in this, is it better or worse for individuals to identify themselves ethnically and nationally? Black American, Asian American, ethnical national, which you should know, right? It's ethnical, E-T-H-N-I-C-A-L. Ethnical national as identification? Or is it better just to identify ethnical as identification or just national as identification? So we have three different ways in which people identify themselves. I am black as identification. I am American as identification. I am black American as identification. Three different ways in which we go about identification. The argument is hegemonic power almost always identifies itself nationally rather than ethnically. It's not always the case, but especially in the United States, this is absolutely the case. Hegemonic power identifies itself nationally. It does not identify itself ethnically, which leads you to believe that the power is in the national identification, right? Not necessarily, but it leads you to believe that the power is constituted in national identification rather than ethnical identification. Some people might want to preserve their ethnical identification. It's not for me to say how you identify yourselves. How do I identify myself? If I think about it, I identify myself as American. I recognize that my color is important insofar as how people interact with me, how people see me, so I don't particularly care. You want to identify me as American? Fine. You want to identify me as a black American? Fine. I don't particularly care. Labels are used to organize people, but I think we can transcend our labels. That's a whole different discussion, which I'm not going to get into now. But what I want you to see are the three ways in which we can identify ourselves. And segregation is built on the attempt to isolate people and to preserve segmented communities within the national diaspora in terms of their ethnical identification. Can we recognize that we are more than our ethnical identifications? Absolutely. We're hyphenated Americans. We're Black, Asian, Hispanic, Native Americans. However, that national identification has been preserved exclusively for the hegemonic class, Americans, but there is a bit of deceit here. It's unfair. There's a sense of unfairness here. Why? Because that identification, that exclusive national identification, is also ethnically based. National identification has been preserved for whites, that's undeniable, and as such, any number of benefits or not arise as a consequence of that. So I'm not going to belabor the point on that. I think you guys see sort of the tripartite way in which individuals, at least within the U.S., go about identification. And I want to move on. Alright, so that's number 4. Number 5. Number 5 is on the next page, top of page 6, exclusion. Not to be confused with expulsion. Exclusion, quote, a pattern of discrimination that denies members of an ethnic group certain positions, independent of the effects of segregation, right? So, positions have been preserved, right? This would result in, and I didn't put this, this would result in nepotism or cronyism, right? We have a hierarchical structure of political, economic power, educational power. These positions have been preserved for members of ethnical subpopulation X and not Y. And though members of ethnical subpopulation Y can advance, quote unquote, up the social ladder, there is a ceiling at which they can no longer advance. And that ceiling has been instituted and preserved based on nepotism and cronyism, right? So you can imagine that nepotism and cronyism would be used to preserve kinship in terms of nepotism, right? Kinship privilege, blood, quote unquote, blood privilege, and in terms of cronyism, sort of favoritism for friends and colleagues and those of the members of a particular subgroup that you have some sort of affinity with. So, rights denial, voting denial, gerrymandering, all facilitate exclusion, right? And it's important to recognize gerrymandering as in terms of the United States, it's undeniable that gerrymandering is a very effective and powerful force for exclusion, and we all know this. You know, it's sort of the elephant in the room. Our representatives represent their districts, but these lines are drawn to facilitate partisan politics, right? So, you know, representative from District X is always going to be a Republican. A representative from District Y is always going to be a Democrat. Why? Because the way in which the districts were drawn are drawn in such a way to preserve constituent communities that tend to vote one political affiliation or the other. What does that do? That excludes representation from the other party. So this happens all the time. There's nothing new here. The one thing that's important is, and this is essential, is that exclusion from political arenas deny an ethnic group the power to move out of its subordinate position. And that's when it becomes dangerous, especially in terms of gerrymandering. It's one thing to say that district lines are drawn in order to preserve partisan politics at the representational level, right? So it's one thing to say that the districts were drawn in order to preserve a Republican seat or a Democratic seat. The truth of the matter, however, is that insofar as that is the case, the tendency becomes that the process of exclusion enforces the beliefs that conform with those partisan politics. And what ends up happening? We don't have a diversity of ideas representing that particular district, representing that particular geographical area. And why is that important? Well, there's no need to change. Social progress isn't felt. It's an artificial incubator, right? I mean, I'm taking this really sort of to another level now, but insofar as we gerrymander our districts, social progress isn't felt as a lived reality, and it is I don't want to say impregnable, because it is pregnable, but it is a volatile, powerful, emotive force, social transformation that is. And you won't necessarily feel the impact of social change and social force if you don't feel that you need to vote in accordance with the transformation of society, because your district has been gerrymandered and you can preserve an old nostalgic sense or an uber progressive radical sense, because your district is constructed in that way. No, if the social need within your particular community is to be less progressive, and that's the actual sentiment within a particular geographic area, then to enforce progress on that area is problematic, right? Because the people aren't ready for it yet. You might want to introduce progress a little bit slower. Similarly, if progress is there and people are ready for social transformation in the community and they want to see more progressive legislation, but the districts are drawn in such a way that it is constructed to preserve a nostalgic era foregone, well, I mean, you can see that there's going to be social upheaval and culture wars, quote unquote. I hate the phrase culture war. I don't know. I've never understood what culture war means, but it's going to enforce culture wars among members of the population. Why? Because there isn't a sense of the necessity of social transformation. I don't need to change my position because my districts are gerrymandered in such a way as to preserve the nostalgia of 4 decades ago, or I can enforce my beliefs on others who don't want to change because my districts are drawn in such a way as to force you to do things that you don't want to do, and that the community collectively isn't yet ready for in terms of social change. So whether you're progressivist or not is not the case here. I don't have bias in either regard. All right, so that's exclusion. Number 6, selective inclusion. So selective inclusion the process of allowing members of ethnic subpopulations into certain positions while at the same time excluding them from others. So the idea is sort of obviously selectivity, right? This would go more in accordance with cronyism than nepotism, but the idea is I've selected those for which I'm going to facilitate their advancement in society. Not necessarily a bad thing, right? If you're in a position as an academic, I'm in a position to say, oh, well, no, this graduate student is performing better than this graduate student, and therefore I'm going to give more resources and more attention to this student than that student. It's completely fine. It's completely legitimate. The idea is, however, in selective inclusion, is that I'm not going to give advantages to those who are performing, if you're talking about merit-based performance, whose effort constitutes recognition, and I'm going to exclude them for any number of reasons, obviously this case being ethnical. That's problematic, right? So it's not so far as you're in a position of power, you do what you will with power in terms of recognition. We all do this. The idea is to deselect, to deny those who have otherwise performed the ability to, quote-unquote, climb the social ladder because of ethnical bias. So the first in selective inclusion would be exclusion, and selective inclusion tend to operate simultaneously, right? The two tend to operate simultaneously. Exclusion and selective inclusion tend to operate simultaneously. Why? As the power, I have two people, A and B. I have selected for, which isn't problematic, but I've selected for as a consequence of excluding, which is problematic, right? Especially if we're talking about sort of merit-based performance. Insofar as you've done, put in the work, contributed effort, as a professor myself, I watched the students, so, well, you wrote an amazing paper, you did great field research, I have money that I've gotten from external donors. I'm in control of how that money is appropriated. I'm going to determine what students get access to that money and what students don't. If I say that performance needs to meet a certain threshold at which funds are then allocated to students, those students who meet that threshold should get it. If I select some students to get it and some students not to get it, that's where it becomes problematic. Okay, having both met the same threshold. So for example, Mexican farm labor in the United States is selectively included while excluded from other opportunities. So in terms of ethnical conflict, I was watching, I forget the guy who did Super Size Me. I forget the guy's name. So the guy who did Super Size Me had this new thing on CNN, and he went and did migrant farming for a day. And of course, as cliche as it sounded, it is a reality. He was the only white guy in the farming community for that day, and everyone else was Mexican men there. Migrant workers, all legitimate work, all legal work. So he goes there to have an experience of the day. And of course the day is, it's just infinitely difficult for him, and he can't perform as well as they can perform. So a segment of our labor force has been preserved for this ethnical identity, that identity being Mexican identity, right? So if you think about this now more specifically, less generally, we have labor force, and we have the totality of the labor force. One segment of the labor force is migrant farming. Let's say another segment of the labor force is high-tech innovation. So we have migrant farming as one element of the labor force, and we have high-tech innovation as another element of the labor force. Mexican farmers, right, an ethnical identity, Mexican-American or Mexican specifically farm labor, has been selected for inclusion in this, but basically selected for, arguing the author, exclusion from all other labor markets, right? So the labor market specific to the farming community, migrant farming community, has been selected for inclusion for Mexican labor, whereas, for example, high-tech innovation, Mexican labor has been excluded from that particular industry. Is it the case that there aren't Mexicans who could contribute to high-tech innovation under the same legal basis that they're allowed to work in the migrant farming community? Couldn't we use that same legal basis to justify their inclusion in high-tech innovation? Of course we could. You can't possibly think that there aren't qualified Mexican migrants who could contribute in this area, but it isn't the case that it occurs. Just to even talk about it sounds almost nonsensical. Why does it sound nonsensical? Because we haven't made the recognition, says the author. So in terms of selective inclusion and selective inclusion, it's almost impossible, if not impossible, to talk about selective inclusion without talking about exclusion, specifically with its relationship to ethnical identity. Mexican ethnical identity has been selectively included for migrant farming within the total labor force. And then lastly, number 7. Abusive practices. Abusive practices. Patterns of action against the victims of discrimination by members of other ethnic groups, and particularly by those charged with law enforcement. So, I mean, you can think about anything. Racial profiling I have here as an example. We have patterns of discrimination, right? So this is Keith, right? There are patterns, right? There's statistically significant patterns of discrimination. It is of statistical significance that this many more blacks, percentage of blacks, are likely to be pulled over than this percentage of whites given exactly the same traffic offense, right? If there is a distinction in the statistical significance, the number, then we need to have sociological research accounting for that. And I'm not going to go into the statistics now because I don't have access to the statistics. But the idea is these patterns are statistical patterns. These are patterns that you as an individual or I as an individual see. These are trends that have been aggregated, patterns that have been aggregated nationally. And based on these national aggregated numbers, we can distill patterns from the numbers. And this is not hard to do at all. I'm not going to go off into a tangent into that. It's not part of the lecture. But the idea is you can identify statistically patterns of discrimination. There is a mathematical fact to discrimination. And the idea is less about the numbers and more about why. Asking ourselves why. Why is it the case that those in law enforcement see African Americans as a threat more so than they see whites or just quote-unquote general Americans as a threat? I'm not saying that that is the case. Assuming this hypothetical situation, why might that be the case? That would inform abusive practices. So another abusive practice that I thought was interesting, I had never thought of this before until I read this, environmental racism, which I thought was very important and also interesting. The dumping of toxic waste in neighborhoods inhabited by poor and relatively powerless ethnic groups. Waste disposal sites are generally located in poor and minority neighborhoods. And the justification for this might be, well, obviously we're going to put waste disposal locations in the middle of poor communities because why would we put it in the middle of rich communities, right? Well, why is the answer to that, the justification to that. It itself exposes more bias, right? And I'm not saying that I have answers to any of this, right? I'm not here to facilitate answering these problems or resolving these conflicts as much as I am here to address the nature of the conflict. So in terms of environmental racism, the idea is it's an abusive practice. Why is it abusive? Because there is a pattern to this practice. It's not that it just happens serendipitously. It's not that this is capricious. What ends up happening is that this is a mode of systemic functioning. In the example of environmental racism, go nationally from city to city, from county to county, from state to state. Look at where the waste disposal sites are. Look at the socioeconomic basis or the surrounding community. What is the socioeconomic demography of the surrounding community? And also what's the majority of ethnical identity within the surrounding community? Aggregate those numbers nationally and see whether or not we need to make social change. Right? This is how social transformation unfolds. Again, if that is the type of research that you're interested in, this conceptually is how you go about justifying and validating your discrimination, your alleged allegations of discrimination. So if you have allegations of discrimination, that because these are some types of discrimination, if you feel that members of a selected community are being discriminated against, you justify with more veracity arguments for discrimination if you can go about aggregating patterns of discrimination that will facilitate the process. So isolated acts of discrimination at the bottom of page 6, this is the last bit. First, the act of discrimination is not sanctioned by cultural values, beliefs, and norms, right? Discrimination is not sanctioned by cultural values, beliefs, and norms. There are exceptions to this in terms of isolated acts of discrimination specifically, not just discrimination in general, isolated acts of discrimination. When we talk about norms, we're talking about general, we're talking about collective. Of course you're going to have instances, isolated instances of discrimination. Ethnical discrimination is going to happen, I would argue, forever. I can't see a time in which ethnical discrimination would end. That's not to say that I'm pessimistic as much as it is to say that I'm very realistic. It's not that we shouldn't fight for inclusion. It's not that we shouldn't call nepotism and cronyism what it is and seek to instantiate socio-political methods to protect and preserve inclusive practices. I'm not saying that we shouldn't do that, but the truth of the matter is no matter what we do, there are going to be attempts to exclude others. In terms of these acts of discrimination, isolated instances, the observation of an isolated instance of discrimination necessitates a fight against that discrimination, and this is what social justice is about. This is what social movements and social inclusion is about. So that's number one. I'm not going to write any of these down on the board. Number two, they are not performed as a matter of policy within an organized structure. Right? They might occur, but it's not the case that they must occur. Right? In terms of a generality, we need to make sure that we differentiate between general practices of inclusion or exclusion and isolated acts of inclusion or exclusion. And then lastly, they are not frequent and pervasive in the informational contact among people within the organization. Isolated acts of discrimination should be treated as such. In terms of systemic discrimination, in terms of systemic marginalization and segregation and exclusion, macro level, these instances of discrimination require more than just sort of one voice, one body. They require collective group identification in opposition to, right? Group identity as a means of organization, which was in the last lecture series, section 1.1. I talked about that, right? Group identification as a means of organization, such that there is an outside force of discrimination that is disproportionately affecting us and quote-unquote our people. It could be ethnically defined, and in opposition to that external force, here is how we're going to organize ourselves. First, we need people to come to help fight this external force, and when you come, we have things for you to do, and such and such and such. So that concludes section 1.2 of my theories of ethnicity and nationalism. I will continue with section 1.3 in the next installment. I want to thank you for taking the time to watch my videos. I'm Dr. Jason J. Campbell. Have a good day.